unspoken rules. Dad was always a weird bloke, strange and strict. I always figured it was just because he was a single parent, but even that didn't seem to justify his odd behavior. He expected the best from me. He expected me to do my chores properly. He expected me to follow his rules. And when I didn't, there was only one punishment he found fitting. Dad never hit me with a belt. He never spanked me with his hand. He never took away my things or gave me timeouts. No, Dad had a different kind of punishment that he used. He introduced the jar when I was 6 years old, and it was introduced after a lot of thought. I remember coming home from my first day of kindergarten and seeing my dad sitting in the living room, the jar on the little side table next to him where the magazines usually sat. The jar looked like it was originally a mason jar. It always smelled a little like brine, and inside were beans. They were speckled pinto beans, the kind I'd used for arts and crafts projects long before I could remember, and it was filled to the brim. Altogether, there were probably 3 bags of beans in there, and a piece of tape marked it as my jar. "Sit down. We need to have a very serious talk," he said. So I just sat on the floor of our living room and looked up at him. He looked really serious, more serious than I'd ever seen him before, and that made me a little scared. Until then, Dad had always been this goofy bloke who played pirates and astronauts or Mario Kart with me. But now, he looked more like a judge about to sentence me to death if I didn't come up with a good defense for my crimes. "You're 6 years old now, and you've long known the difference between right and wrong. In this family, we have a tradition of disciplining our kids with the bean jar. You see this jar?" he asked, as if I could have missed it. I nodded, and he smiled, pleased. "This bean jar represents you. It's everything you are and everything you could be. So, from now on, if you're bad or cheeky or disobey my commands, I won't yell at you or send you to your room. I won't do anything except take 1 bean out of the jar." I almost laughed. Was this a game or something? Was I supposed to be scared of a jar of beans? This had to be one of Dad's jokes again. Dad was always doing things like this, telling me monsters in my closet could be kept away by a teddy bear, or that the tooth gobblers would eat my teeth if I didn't brush them twice a day. Dad was a jokester. He always had been. But I think it was the look on his face that made me second guess whether this was a joke or not. The whole time he just sat there, dead serious, and didn't take his eyes off me. "You're a smart kid, just like I was, and I can see now that you'll need an example. You might think this is just a normal jar, but you're wrong," he said, reaching in and pulling out 1 bean very slowly. He didn't even fully take it out. He just lifted it a bit, letting it hover over the pile. But that was all he needed to do. Suddenly, somehow, it felt like someone was touching my brain. It was this wave of sadness, this sudden unease, and I wanted him to drop the bean back into the jar. I needed to be whole. I needed all my beans, and he must have seen it on my face because he dropped the bean back in. I was trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I'm sorry, but you need to know what's at stake here. You're my last chance. I have to make sure you're perfect." The bean jar knows the difference between perfection and failure. My own father used this method, and his father before him, and his father before that. The bean jar will be used until your 18th birthday, or until all the beans are gone. I gasped and asked him what would happen if all the beans were gone. He looked at me without a hint of humor or mischief and said, "You don't want to know." And so, the bean jar began. Dad didn't suddenly become a villain or turn into a monster overnight. He went back to being the same bloke he always was. We played video games together, built Lego, and after school, we'd mess around as if everything was normal. My dad had never scared me like this before. We were really close, but I remember how he got when he had to take a bean out of the jar. His face would go completely neutral, and he'd walk over to the jar, take out a bean, and crush it between his thumb and forefinger. The bean jar was used even for the smallest infractions. Forget to do the dishes? Lose a bean. Forget to put my clothes away? Lose a bean. Stay up too late on a school night? Lose a bean. There was no escalation. It didn't matter if I forgot to pick up my toys or if I yelled at Dad when I was frustrated. It was always 1 bean after another, crushed between his big, rough fingers. He'd always look at me with a mix of pain and determination once it was done, but his stoicism didn't go far. The times when he took more than one bean were unbearable. It felt like each bean was a piece of my psyche being turned into dust. As a kid, I became hyper-aware of everything I did because of the beans. But I was still just a kid. Sometimes I forgot things, sometimes I was lazy, and sometimes I thought I could get away with not doing what I was told. I never did. I always got caught, always got punished, and always felt this anxious, nervous feeling when it came time for him to take out another bean. I hated how it felt when he crushed the beans, and I didn't want to lose another. I didn't want to lose them so badly that I trained myself to make sure I did everything I was supposed to. 5 a.m., wash face. 5:20, make breakfast. 5:30, wash dishes. 5:40, wash dishes. 5:40, get dressed. 6 a.m., clean my room. 6:30, put on my backpack and stand by the door fully dressed, ready to go. 1 p.m., come home, do homework. 4:30, tidy up the house. 5 p.m., start dinner. 6 p.m., eat when dad gets home. 9 p.m., brush teeth, shower. 9:30, bedtime. Every day these things were done without fail. Otherwise, I'd be one bean less. Eventually, this manifested in a sort of mania inside me. I had to not only do my chores but get good grades. But after a while, good wasn't good enough. What if dad decided B's and C's weren't good enough anymore? I strove for straight A's, and dad seemed pleased with my efforts. For the other kids though, I was just a weirdo with no friends. Dad was my only friend, but it was a strange kind of friendship, like living with someone who had schizophrenia and could change at the drop of a hat. I didn't make real friends until high school when I met Cass. Cassandra Bigley wasn't what you'd call a model student. Her parents had high expectations for her, but she was pretty average at best. She came to me because I was the smartest kid in school, or at least that's what the other kids thought. She asked me to help her, so I tutored her, showed her the ropes, and soon enough her grades started to improve. We became friends, and she was the first to learn about the bean jar. "So he just takes out a bean and crushes it?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, not really realizing how weird it sounded. "And what, you just have fewer beans?" I thought about it. Dad had never told me what would happen, only that it'd be terrible if all the beans were taken out. Something bad will happen when all the beans are gone. What? A month with no dessert? I don't know, but I do know that when he crushes a bean, it feels like a piece of my mind is crushed with it. I feel crazy after he crushes one. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I started crying. I hadn't meant to. I was already 16, and I didn't really cry anymore. But Cass didn't make me feel bad about it. She just held me while I cried, and eventually I stopped. It felt good to be held. Dad hugged me sometimes, but he never really comforted me. I didn't have a mom whose job seemed to be to comfort their kids. But when Cass held me, I realized what I had been missing all those years. I'd missed a mom I'd never even known. After that, Cass and I were together a lot. Despite our age, it never became inappropriate. She gave me something I hadn't had before. A friend, without the threat of punishment hanging over our relationship. That realization made me see my dad in a different light. He was still the lovable goofball he always was, but I began to understand our entire relationship. I suffered under the shadow of that bean jar. The further I distanced myself from it, the grumpier and more suspicious Dad became. I often saw him holding the bean jar as if he wanted to smash it. But if I didn't misbehave, he couldn't do it. That was always the deal. He knew it, I knew it, and he knew he couldn't punish me as long as I followed the rules. Though it might sound like it, Dad was never cruel with the bean jar. He never used it to take out his frustrations. He never came home and punished me just because he had a bad day. The rules were clear, and we had both agreed to them. I knew that if I followed them, I was safe. I think deep down, Dad really believed he was doing what was best for me, that he was shaping me into something better, something more than I could be. And I think he was right, even though it wasn't fair. Not really. Then one day, everything came to a head when I got home from Cass's. Dad was supposed to be at work, so Cass and I came back to play video games. She had never seen a Super Nintendo before and wanted to challenge me to Mario Kart. We came in, laughing and joking, when someone cleared their throat loudly, sending a chill down my spine. I turned around slowly to see my dad sitting on the couch. It looked eerily similar to the day he had introduced the bean jar, and and he had that same look on his face, one filled with pain and determination. "You're late home, your chores aren't done, your homework isn't finished, and you've brought someone over without permission. Why did you decide to break the rules this way?" I watched as the hammer dropped onto the table, but I hadn't noticed what he had done until then. He had crushed a bean that he had set there, and I shuddered as I held my head and groaned. If he noticed, he didn't comment. He simply smashed another bean, another one. I felt like I was going to throw up as a pain like no other ripped through me. He had lined up 4, one for each transgression. He had never done this before. It was always just one bean, and that had been bad enough, but this was unbearable. "Stop!" Cass screamed. "Whatever you're doing, stop it!" But he cut her off. He grabbed her by the arm and pushed her towards the door. "This is your fault. You've changed him, made him forget his purpose, but I won't let you kill him. You're not allowed in this house anymore. Never again." I snapped to attention, finding my feet and swaying a little. "You're not gonna touch her." My dad looked at me, disbelief on his face. "Let her go, now," I repeated, stepping right up to him in his face. You dare challenge me? You're no different than the others. I've tried to raise you better, but it seems I was a fool. I'll crush every bloody bean in this jar if I have to. When all the beans are gone, you'll cease to exist. I'll smash every bloody bean just to prove it. Just to prove. But he didn't finish. He dropped the hammer as he clutched at his chest. It slipped from his grip as he wheezed and beat his chest. His face had turned quickly from red to purple, and by the time he hit the floor, it was almost black. I just stood there for a moment, hearing Cass banging on the door, asking what was going on. I couldn't answer. I just stood there, feeling like I was choking as the realization hit me. My dad was dead. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I've been living with Cass. Her parents kindly took me in. Cass and I are preparing for college, and that's when the house came to mind. It was still standing, and I decided it might be a good idea to sell it to help pay for tuition. I'd been there a few times to gather things, and I knew that Dad's room had remained mostly untouched. The police hadn't bothered to search the house. After all, Dad's death was no mystery. They had ruled it a heart attack and spared me a long interrogation. At the beginning of summer, I started clearing things out, selling what I could, donating what I couldn't. I found photos of Dad and me taken during better times. It didn't take long before I'd cleared everything out, leaving only Dad's room. I paused at the door, feeling almost like an intruder as I considered going in. But in the end, I told myself that this was my house now, and this room was as good as mine. The room was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a dresser, and a wardrobe. But what I found inside surprised me. 5 mason jars, each with a different name on them. Jacob, Mark, Sylvester, Katie, and James. They were empty. The lids were off, and the taped-on names made them look just like mine. What the hell was this? Who were these people? I didn't know any of them, and no one had ever lived in the house but Dad and me. It had always just been the 2 of us. Always. No, that couldn't be right. My mom had lived with us once, hadn't she? In the back there was a 6th jar, broken, but the tape was still intact. Maggie. "When all the beans are gone, you'll cease to exist," I heard Dad's voice in my head. Were the names on these jars real people? Had I lived with them and just forgotten them? How can you remember people who never existed? I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of it all. Finally, I decided to write it all down before it got even more confusing. Clearly, Dad wasn't as crazy as I had thought. And maybe I should have had more respect for the bean jar. It sits now on the shelf in the living room. I took it out of the house before selling it, and I guard it carefully. I don't know if it still works the way it did when Dad was alive, but I'm certainly not willing to take any chances.